A 12-year-old boy takes the stand to testify against a corrupt cop, shocking the courtroom with his revelations. As he speaks, he exposes the officer's crimes with undeniable video evidence, leaving everyone stunned. The officer is arrested on the spot, and the boy's bravery sparks a movement proving that truth and courage have no age. No one believed that a child could stand up to a powerful officer, let alone expose him in front of a judge. But as young Jamal began to speak, the air in the courtroom grew heavy with tension. His words, steady and fearless, carried a truth so shocking that even the judge had to pause. What could a boy possibly say that would turn the entire case upside down? Would you have had the courage to speak out like Jamal, or would you have stayed silent in fear? Before we dive in, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful, real-life inspired stories. A corrupt cop, a child brave enough to defy him, and a courtroom hanging on every word. What you're about to witness will change lives forever. Stay tuned, because this story is one you won't forget. Jamal sat on the hard wooden bench, his small hands clenched together as he stared at the courtroom floor. At 12 years old, he was too young to fully understand the legal terms being thrown around, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just another case. This was about right and wrong. This was about justice. He had always been different from other kids his age, sharp-eyed, observant, and wise beyond his years. Growing up in a tight-knit neighborhood, he had learned early that people took care of each other. Kids played outside without fear, and neighbors shared meals and stories like family. But lately, that feeling had started to fade. People locked their doors earlier, spoke in hushed voices, and looked over their shoulders whenever a police car passed by. And all of it led back to one man, Officer Grayson. Grayson had been patrolling their streets for years, but not to serve and protect. He had built his own rule of fear, fabricating charges, planting evidence, and arresting innocent people without hesitation. Those who spoke up against him found themselves in handcuffs. Or, worse, no one dared to challenge him because they all knew the system was on his side. Until now, Jamal had learned about justice from his father, a man who had always taught him that doing the right thing mattered, no matter the cost. But his father was gone now, and for the first time, Jamal felt truly alone. Yet, as he sat in that courtroom surrounded by strangers, reporters, and murmuring voices, he knew he had to be strong. The public gallery was packed, every seat filled with journalists, lawyers, and community members who had come to witness the trial. Some whispered that Jamal wouldn't stand a chance, that his words would be dismissed. Others sat with hopeful eyes, praying that this time justice would win. His mother sat a few rows behind him, her fingers gripping the edge of her purse. She had begged him not to do this. She had pleaded with the lawyers, asking if there was any way her son could be protected. She knew the system. It wasn't built for boys like Jamal. It had never been. Across the room, Officer Grayson leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, a smug smirk on his face. He had seen countless trials before, had watched innocent men and women fall under false charges, all because of his own fabricated stories. And today, he wasn't worried. He barely spared a glance at the boy across the room. He had no doubt that this child's testimony would be meaningless. A 12-year-old? What could a kid possibly say that would hold up in court? The air was thick with tension as the judge called Jamal to the stand. People leaned forward. Whispers filled the courtroom. Can a kid really take down a cop? What if the system protects Grayson like it always has? Does Jameer even stand a chance? Jameer felt his heartbeat pounding in his chest. His feet barely touched the ground as he made his way up to the witness stand. He took a deep breath as he raised his right hand to be sworn in. The entire courtroom fell silent. It was time. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the trial officially began. The judge called for silence and the prosecutor stood, straightening his suit before addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and firm, "we are here today because Officer Daniel Grayson is accused of fabricating evidence that led to the wrongful arrest of an innocent man." A wave of unease rippled through the public gallery. The community had long whispered about Officer Grayson's abuse of power, but this was the first time it had ever been brought to court. The prosecutor continued, "We will present evidence that proves Officer Grayson deliberately planted drugs in a civilian's vehicle, knowing full well the man had committed no crime. And while many in the community have remained silent out of fear, one brave witness has come forward." All eyes shifted toward Jameer, sitting at the witness stand, his feet barely touching the floor. At the defense table, Officer Grayson sat relaxed, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. He glanced at his lawyer, who leaned in and whispered something, and then shook his head, as if this entire trial were a joke. His lawyer stood and addressed the court with an air of confidence. "Your Honor, I would like to remind everyone that the prosecution's so-called star witness is a 12-year-old child." He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "We're expected to believe that a child, whose mind is still developing, who is easily impressionable, somehow remembers exact details of an event that happened weeks ago." The defense lawyer scoffed, shaking his head. "I don't mean any disrespect, but let's be realistic here. How reliable can a 12-year-old's memory really be?" A few jurors exchanged uncertain glances. The tension in the room thickened. The prosecutor remained composed, turning back toward Jameer. He approached the witness stand carefully, lowering his voice to a gentle but firm tone. "Jameer," he said, "I know this is difficult, but I want you to take a deep breath. You're safe here. No one can hurt you. Just tell us, in your own words, what you saw the night Officer Grayson arrested Mr. Lewis." Jameer swallowed hard. His fingers gripped the edge of the wooden chair as he took a shaky breath. The courtroom was too big, too quiet, too full of eyes waiting for him to speak. But he had come here for a reason, so he straightened his back, lifted his chin, and spoke. "I was sitting on my front steps that night," he began, his voice stronger than he expected. "It was late. My mom had already told me to go inside, but I stayed out a little longer. That's when I saw Officer Grayson pull Mr. Lewis over." A hush spread through the courtroom. At first I thought maybe it was just a normal stop. But then I saw it. Jameer's voice didn't waver. "I saw Officer Grayson take something out of his pocket, a small plastic bag, and then, when Mr. Lewis wasn't looking, he dropped it into the car." Gasps filled the room. Someone in the gallery muttered a curse under their breath. At the defense table, Officer Grayson's smirk twitched. For the first time, a shadow of unease flickered across his face. His lawyer, however, was ready. "Objection!" The defense attorney stood sharply. "Your Honor, this is speculation at best. We have no way of knowing what the child actually saw." The judge held up a hand. Overruled. Continue, young man. Jameer took a deep breath. I didn't know what was happening at first, he admitted. But then I saw Officer Grayson turn on his body camera, after he had already put the bag in the car. A ripple of shock moved through the courtroom. Even the jurors leaned forward slightly. Officer Grayson leaned back in his seat, his expression carefully neutral, but Jameer could feel his stare. The officer's confidence had not wavered. Not yet. The defense lawyer wasted no time trying to unravel the testimony. Jameer, he said smoothly, his voice laced with mock sympathy. It's understandable that things might have been confusing for you that night. It was late, you were tired. Maybe you misremembered what you saw? Jameer didn't blink. No, he said firmly. I remember everything. The lawyer tilted his head. Everything? Yes, Jameer said. Then, for the first time, he turned his eyes directly toward Officer Grayson. And I have proof. The room erupted in whispers. Officer Grayson's smug expression froze. The judge slammed his gavel. Order, order in the court. But the tension had already boiled over. Jameer had just turned the case upside down. The courtroom fell into complete silence as Jameer's words echoed through the air. And I have proof. For the first time since the trial began, Officer Grayson shifted in his seat. The smug confidence that had never wavered cracked, just slightly. His fingers curled into fists against the defense table as he locked eyes with Jameer. The once arrogant officer, who had spent years getting away with corruption, now looked uneasy for the first time. The judge leaned forward, intrigued. Young man, he said, his voice steady but firm. What do you mean by proof? Jameer swallowed but didn't hesitate. He reached into the pocket of his oversized hoodie and pulled out an old, slightly cracked phone. It had once belonged to his father, a reminder of the lessons he had passed down. Jameer had carried it with him every day since his father's passing, but now, for the first time, it held more than memories. I recorded everything that night, Jameer said, holding up the device for the entire courtroom to see. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The sound of chairs creaking, bodies shifting, and anxious whispers filled the room. Even the jury looked stunned. The gallery, packed with reporters and community members, leaned forward, straining to see the device that could change everything. The defense lawyer was on his feet in an instant. Objection! Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The witness never disclosed. The judge lifted a hand, cutting him off. Sit down, Mr. Reynolds. The evidence will be reviewed. The lawyer clenched his jaw but obeyed, throwing a quick glance at Grayson. But the officer wasn't smirking anymore. The once confident demeanor had shifted to something else. Calculated worry. The judge turned to Jameer. Hand the device to the bailiff, he instructed. With steady hands, Jameer passed the phone to the uniformed officer, who carried it to the court's technical team. The judge nodded toward the prosecutor. Proceed. A tense moment followed as the screen lit up, casting a glow across the silent room. Then the video played. The grainy footage showed Officer Grayson standing beside a parked car. The timestamp in the corner confirmed the night of the arrest. Under the dim glow of the streetlights, his movements were clear. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small plastic bag, and then, while the driver, Mr. Lewis, was distracted, he dropped it inside the car. A loud gasp broke through the courtroom. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth, while others exchanged stunned glances. The evidence was clear and undeniable. The video cut to another moment. Grayson turning toward the camera, toward Jameer. His voice was low, sharp, filled with quiet menace. "You didn't see anything, kid. Keep quiet, or things will get worse for your family." The entire courtroom went still. Officer Grayson's own voice had just sealed his fate. The defense lawyer jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this is... The judge banged his gavel. "Order in the court." His voice cut through the chaos as reporters frantically jotted down notes, some whispering into their phones. The entire trial had just flipped in an instant. Grayson's face had lost all color. His eyes darted between the judge, the jury, and his own lawyer, desperately searching for an escape. But there was none. His own words had betrayed him. The defense lawyer stammered, trying to recover. "Your Honor, we need time to—" "Save it," the judge said, his voice cold and firm. He turned to the prosecution. "Mr. Carter, do you have any further questions for the witness?" The prosecutor nodded and approached Jameer. "Jameer, you knew how dangerous this was. You knew what could happen if you spoke out. Why did you take that risk?" Jameer exhaled slowly. Then he lifted his chin and looked straight ahead. "Because my dad always told me that the truth matters, even when people are afraid of it." The room fell completely silent once more. The judge turned to Officer Grayson. "Officer Daniel Grayson, in light of this new evidence, the court will move forward with immediate action regarding your charges." Grayson closed his eyes. His career, his power, it was over. The entire courtroom now saw him for what he truly was, and it had all started because one brave 12-year-old refused to stay silent. The courtroom remained eerily silent, the weight of the evidence pressing down on every person in the room. The video had shattered everything: Grayson's carefully maintained reputation, the defense's strategy, and the illusion that justice always favored those in power. But the true bombshell was yet to come. The prosecutor turned back to the judge, his voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, in light of this evidence, I'd like to request an immediate review of Officer Grayson's record. Given the nature of this case, it is highly likely that this isn't the first time he has fabricated charges." The judge nodded gravely, then gestured toward a clerk. "Pull up Officer Grayson's disciplinary history," he ordered. A tense moment passed as the clerk worked, typing quickly. The courtroom held its breath. Was this truly just one corrupt act, or was there more? Then the screen flickered to life, displaying Grayson's internal police records, and the truth hit like a thunderclap. Multiple complaints, dozens of questionable arrests, a pattern of misconduct spanning years. A wave of gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters whispered frantically into their phones, typing away at breakneck speed. Some jury members shook their heads in disgust, realizing that this was not just one mistake. This was a pattern of abuse that had gone unchecked for far too long. A woman in the crowd suddenly stood up, her voice trembling with emotion. "He did the same thing to my brother," she cried. "Planted drugs on him, too." Another voice followed. "My cousin. He got locked up because of Grayson." More and more people stood, their voices rising in a chorus of long-suppressed pain. The defense lawyer looked panicked, flipping through his notes as if searching for a way to undo the damage. "Your Honor, this is hearsay. We have no proof that these other cases—" The judge slammed his gavel. "Enough." His voice carried undeniable authority. He turned toward the prosecution. "Proceed with the charges." The prosecutor cleared his throat, then turned to the court. "Your Honor, given the overwhelming evidence presented here today, the state is officially pressing charges against Officer Daniel Grayson for falsifying evidence, misconduct, and abuse of power." Another gasp swept through the room. The judge's voice was unshakable as he gave his ruling. "Officer Daniel Grayson, you are hereby placed under arrest." The moment felt surreal. Two uniformed officers approached the defense table, reaching for their handcuffs. Grayson's smirk was gone. His usual arrogance had vanished, replaced with wide-eyed panic. "No, wait, this is a setup," he barked, shaking his head furiously. "This kid, he's lying. The video, it's fake. I'm being framed." No one believed him. The once feared officer, who had used his badge to instill fear and control, now looked small, powerless, desperate. The officers yanked him to his feet, twisting his arms behind his back. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the silent courtroom. Grayson thrashed against the officers, his voice cracking. "You can't do this. I was protecting the city. This is all wrong." The judge ignored his outburst and turned toward the jury. "Let the record show that Officer Daniel Grayson has been formally charged and will be held without bail until trial." For the first time since the trial started, Jameer exhaled. His mother, sitting in the front row, covered her mouth with trembling hands. Her eyes glistened with tears, of pride, of relief, of disbelief that this was actually happening. Her son, just 12 years old, had done what no one else had dared to do. He had exposed the truth. As Jameer stood up to leave the witness stand, the room erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even calling his name. Jameer turned, scanning the faces in the crowd. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight, never thought his testimony would mean so much to so many people. And yet, in that moment, he knew. He had changed history. The impact of Jameer's testimony spread far beyond the courtroom walls. His bravery had set off a ripple effect that no one could have predicted. For years, people in his neighborhood had lived in fear, trapped under the weight of injustice. But now, for the first time, they had hope. The community, once silenced by intimidation, began to speak out. More people came forward with their own stories, revealing that Officer Grayson was just the beginning. Investigations were launched, uncovering a network of corruption within the police force. Several other officers, once thought untouchable, were now under scrutiny. The headlines ran with Jameer's story, calling him the boy who took down a corrupt cop. His face was everywhere, on news stations, social media, and even newspapers. But to him, this wasn't about fame. It was about justice. As the weeks passed, his courage gained the attention of the legal community. A well-respected civil rights attorney, Mr. Caldwell, reached out to Jameer's family. He saw something in the boy, a future leader. One afternoon, as Jameer and his mother sat in their small living room, Mr. Caldwell placed a hand on Jameer's shoulder. "You have a gift. Son," he said, his voice warm with admiration. "The way you stood up for the truth, the way you held your ground in that courtroom, that's something most grown men wouldn't have the courage to do. If you're interested, I'd like to mentor you, teach you about the law. Maybe one day, you'll be the one sitting in that courtroom, not as a witness but as a lawyer." Jameer's mother's eyes filled with tears. "You really think he could do that?" "I don't think," Mr. Caldwell said with a smile. I know. For the first time, people no longer saw Jameer as just a kid. He had become a voice for justice, a leader in the making. Meanwhile, Officer Grayson faced the consequences of his actions. Stripped of his badge, he was no longer feared. His crimes had been exposed to the world, and his once commanding presence had crumbled into shame and isolation. The same system he had abused now turned against him, sentencing him to years in prison. There were no more cover-ups, no more lies. Justice had finally been served. On the night of Grayson's conviction, Jameer and his mother sat on their apartment balcony, looking out at the neighborhood that now felt different. The fear that had once hung over them was lifting. His mother turned to him, her voice soft, with emotion. "Your dad would be proud of you." Jameer swallowed the lump in his throat. He had missed his father every single day since he had passed. But tonight, for the first time, he didn't just miss him. He felt him. His father had always taught him to stand up for what was right, even when it was hard, even when he was afraid. Jameer had done that. He had done exactly what his father would have wanted. Taking a deep breath, Jameer looked out at the city lights and spoke the words that had been in his heart since the trial ended. "People think kids don't see the truth," he said quietly. "But sometimes we're the only ones brave enough to tell it." And in that moment, he knew. It had all been worth it. This story proves that courage knows no age. Jameer was just 12 years old, yet he stood against corruption and injustice when no one else would. Would you have had the strength to stand up against Officer Grayson? Have you ever witnessed injustice? What would you have done if you were in Jameer's place? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more real-life inspired stories that challenge perspectives and reveal the truth about standing up for what's right. Stay tuned for another unbelievable story next time. You won't want to miss it.